In February of 1947, Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd climbed into a modified transport aircraft somewhere near the edge of the Antarctic continent and flew for approximately 7 hours before turning around. By his own account, recorded in his personal diary and later referenced in multiple public statements, he traveled roughly 1,700 miles beyond the South Pole into territory that, by every official map ever published, should have been nothing but ice. He never fully explained what he found there. 4 months later, in August of 1947, a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio published an interview with Byrd that would become one of the most debated documents in alternative history circles for the next 70 years. In that interview, Byrd made statements so unusual that mainstream American press outlets apparently chose not to reprint them. Not a single major American newspaper picked up the story. Not the New York Times, not the Washington Post, not the Chicago Tribune. The interview appeared, circulated briefly in South America, and then went quiet. If you believe the official version of events, that silence is easily explained. The interview was either misquoted, mistranslated, or taken out of context by a foreign publication that did not fully understand what Byrd was trying to say. Byrd was a decorated naval officer, a national hero, a man who had spent his career expanding American geographical knowledge. The idea that he would say something the American press would find unprintable seems, on its surface, absurd. But here is the problem with that explanation. The statements attributed to Byrd in the El Mercurio interview were not ambiguous. They were not the kind of offhand remarks that a translator might misinterpret. They were specific, directional, and deeply strange. And they connected to a much larger pattern of information suppression that researchers working in the Tartarian framework have been documenting for decades. If you have spent any time in alternative history spaces, you already know that the Tartaria thesis is not really about a single empire. It is about a missing civilization. A global culture of extraordinary technical sophistication that was deliberately erased from the historical record sometime in the 18th or 19th century. The evidence for this erasure shows up everywhere once you know what to look for. In architectural anomalies, in historical maps that show coastlines no European explorer had yet reached, in energy infrastructure built into the foundations of buildings that were supposedly constructed by hand labor in a matter of months for world's fairs, and in geography, specifically in the geography of the polar regions. The Byrd interview sits exactly at the intersection of all of these threads. Subscribe if you have not already. This is going to take everything you thought you knew about the post-war world and pull it apart at the seams. To understand why the El Mercurio interview matters so much, you first have to understand who Richard Byrd actually was by 1947. This was not a fringe figure. This was not a conspiracy theorist or a crackpot. This was one of the most decorated military officers in American history. He had led 5 separate expeditions to Antarctica. He had received the Medal of Honor. He had overflown both the North and South Poles. Franklin Roosevelt personally trusted him with classified geographic missions. If any American alive in 1947 had earned the right to make authoritative statements about polar geography, it was Richard Byrd, which makes what he said in Chile all the more extraordinary. The specific passage from the El Mercurio interview that researchers keep returning to involves Byrd's description of territory beyond the poles. In the interview, he reportedly stated that he was not interested in a new land that lies beyond the poles, but that in the case of a new conflict, the United States could be attacked by enemies flying from one polar region to another at incredible speeds. He described a landmass of mystery beyond the pole, using language that implied genuine geographic terrain rather than open ocean. Read that again carefully. A landmass of mystery, beyond the pole. That was not metaphor. That was not poetry. That was a decorated American naval officer in a foreign newspaper describing geography that does not appear on any official map. The American press did not touch it. Now, defenders of the mainstream narrative will tell you that Byrd was talking about military vulnerability, that his comments about enemies attacking from polar regions were simply Cold War threat assessments, that the phrase land mass of mystery was a translation artifact from Spanish to English, and that the original statement was less dramatic. Some researchers have spent considerable effort trying to locate the original Spanish text to verify this. Here is the problem with the translation argument. Multiple independent researchers working from different source texts have arrived at essentially the same quotes. The phrasing varies slightly depending on who is doing the translating, but the core content remains consistent. Byrd described geographic territory beyond the poles that was not on official maps. He described it in terms that suggested personal knowledge rather than speculation. and he connected it to military threat assessments that implied this territory was not empty. If the interview was simply a mistranslation or a misquotation, it was a remarkably consistent one across multiple independent translations spanning 7 decades. Before we go further into the Byrd material, we need to establish why the polar regions occupy such a central place in the Tartarian research framework, because this is not arbitrary. The interest in Antarctica and the Arctic, among alternative historians, is not simply a fascination with remote geography. It is based on a specific historical argument about what these regions were used for before the civilization reset. The Tartarian thesis holds that the civilization we are currently calling Western modernity is not actually the first advanced civilization on this planet. It is, rather, a successor civilization that emerged from the ashes of a much older global culture. That global culture, which researchers have attached the Tartarian label to largely because of its appearance on 17th and 18th century maps as a vast empire spanning Central Asia, Russia and beyond, was apparently capable of things that our current civilization cannot fully replicate. Free energy transmission, massive construction using techniques we do not understand, global navigation using maps that predate any voyages we have official records of. The polar regions matter in this framework for a specific reason. If you accept the mud flood theory that sits alongside the Tartarian thesis, the surface of the Earth was buried under massive amounts of mud and debris sometime in the 18th or early 19th century. This reset event covered the evidence of the previous civilization. What got covered varied by region, but the polar areas, because of their remoteness and their status as geopolitically controlled zones, may have been less thoroughly covered and less thoroughly documented than other areas. In other words, the poles may be where the Old World survived. And Admiral Richard Byrd, by his own account, flew toward that surviving Old World in February of 1947 and was apparently so disturbed by what he found that he discussed it with a Chilean newspaper rather than an American one. The 1947 Byrd expedition deserves its own detailed examination because the official story surrounding it is, to put it charitably, incomplete. The expedition was called Operation High Jump. It was officially described as a training exercise for American military personnel in cold weather operations. It involved 4,700 military personnel, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. That is not a training exercise, that is a military operation. The scale of resources committed to Operation High Jump has puzzled historians for decades, because the official justification simply does not match the logistical footprint. The operation was also cut short. Originally planned to last 6 to 8 months, Operation High Jump was terminated after approximately 8 weeks. The official reason given was deteriorating weather conditions. But weather deterioration in Antarctica is expected and planned for. Naval operations at that scale do not get abandoned after 8 weeks because of weather. Something happened during Operation High Jump that caused the United States military to pull out of Antarctica faster than planned. Byrd returned from the expedition and, according to multiple accounts, was debriefed by military and intelligence officials. Shortly after that debriefing, he gave the El Mercurio interview. And the things he said in that interview were not the things a military officer says when a training exercise has gone according to plan. He described flying into territory beyond the pole that contained vegetation, that contained mountains. That contained, according to the most aggressive translations of his diary rather than the newspaper interview, signs of habitation. He described an inner Earth that was temperate and alive in ways that no model of Antarctic geography can account for. The American press printed none of this. Let us now go deeper into the specific Tartarian connection, because this is where the research gets genuinely interesting and genuinely difficult to dismiss. One of the foundational claims of the Tartarian historical framework is that old maps show a different world than the one we currently inhabit. Specifically, several maps from the 16th and 17th centuries show Antarctica with coastline detail that European explorers supposedly had not yet reached. The Piri Reis map of 1513 is the most famous example. It shows a southern continent with what appears to be a detailed coastal geography that matches the subglacial topography of Antarctica, meaning the coastline of Antarctica as it would appear without ice covering it. Official scholarship explains this by suggesting that Piri Reis either compiled information from earlier unknown voyages, or that the southern continent shown is actually a distorted representation of South America. Both explanations have been challenged extensively by researchers who point out that the level of cartographic detail in the Piri Reis map cannot be explained by simple geographic distortion or legendary embellishment. What if the map was accurate because the civilization that made it had actually been there? What if the coastline shown on the Piri Reis map was based on direct geographic knowledge of a temperate, ice-free Antarctica that existed before whatever catastrophic event covered it in ice? This is where Byrd's 1,947 statements become so significant within the Tartarian framework. If there is geography beyond the poles that does not appear on official maps, and if Byrd encountered that geography during Operation High Jump, then his statements to the Chilean press were not the confused ramblings of an exhausted explorer. They were the carefully worded public disclosure of a man who had found evidence that the official geography of the planet was incomplete or deliberately falsified. The deliberate falsification possibility is the one that the Tartarian research community takes most seriously, and it is worth spending some time on why. One of the central arguments in the Tartaria framework is that the civilization reset of the 18th and 19th centuries was not simply a natural catastrophe, it was managed. The survivors of the catastrophe, whoever they were, made conscious decisions about what information would be preserved and what information would be suppressed. Geography was among the most aggressively suppressed categories of information because geography determines what resources exist, where populations can settle, and what political arrangements are possible. If there is habitable land beyond the poles, that land changes everything. It changes resource calculations, it changes population capacity. It changes the feasibility of political independence from existing power structures. Whoever controls access to the knowledge of that land controls something enormously valuable. The American press's refusal to reprint the Byrd interview begins to look less like editorial judgment and more like coordinated suppression when you view it through this lens. We should be careful here to distinguish between what we know and what we are inferring. What we know is that Byrd gave an interview to El Mercurio in 1947. We know that the interview contained statements about land masses beyond the poles that were unusual and geographically provocative. We know that American press outlets did not reprint the interview. We know that Operation High Jump was cut short under circumstances that the military never fully explained. What we are inferring is the reason for all of this. An inference, in the absence of documentary proof, should be held carefully. The Tartarian research framework is strongest when it acknowledges this distinction, and weakest when it collapses inference into certainty. That said, the inference that something significant was suppressed is not unreasonable. The pattern is too consistent, the timing is too specific, and the subsequent behavior of the American government toward Antarctic access and information is too restrictive to be explained simply by Cold War security concerns. Consider what happened to Antarctica in the decade following Operation High Jump. In 1948, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina began negotiating what would eventually become the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. The treaty designated Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banned military activity on the continent, and crucially banned nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste there. It also established a framework for territorial claims that effectively froze all national sovereignty over the continent. The Antarctic Treaty has been described by mainstream historians as a Cold War diplomatic achievement, a rare example of international cooperation in a period of global tension. That description is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not explain why so many militarily competing nations agreed so quickly and so comprehensively to internationalize a continent that nobody had yet proven to have significant strategic value, unless they all knew it had extraordinary strategic value, and unless they all agreed that the most expedient solution was to collectively classify that value under the cover of scientific cooperation. The Antarctic Treaty essentially took the entire continent off the table for national competition. No nation could claim it, no corporation could develop it, no military force could establish a permanent presence there. The continent was sealed behind a legal framework that made independent exploration extremely difficult and required international scientific authorization for virtually any activity. If you were trying to protect access to information about what Antarctica actually contains, you could not design a more effective legal mechanism than the Antarctic Treaty. Byrd's El Mercurio interview was published in 1947. The Antarctic Treaty negotiations began in 1948. 1 year separates those two events. The Tartarian research community has long argued that there is an architectural signature of the old civilization that appears across the planet in buildings that official history attributes to the 19th century, but that display technical capabilities far beyond what 19th century construction methods should have produced. The crystal palaces, the massive domed structures, the intricate stonework of World's Fair buildings, the energy infrastructure built into government and civic architecture. The argument is that these buildings were not constructed by the civilizations that claimed to build them. They were inherited. They were remnants of the Tartarian world that survived the reset event. The polar geography argument runs parallel to this architectural argument. Just as the buildings are too sophisticated to have been built by the civilization that claims them, the maps are too accurate to have been drawn by the civilization that claims to have drawn them. And just as the buildings are being demolished and replaced at an accelerating rate, the accurate geographical knowledge represented in those old maps is being systematically replaced by a sanitized official geography that removes the uncomfortable details. What would it mean if there was land beyond the pole? This is a question that most alternative history researchers approach with appropriate caution, because the implications are so large that they require careful unpacking. But it is worth sitting with the question seriously, because it changes the fundamental parameters of human history in ways that are not trivial. If there is temperate, habitable land beyond the Antarctic and Arctic circles, then the carrying capacity of the Earth is larger than we have been told. The number of people who could be sustained on this planet's surface is higher than any official estimate. The political and economic arrangements that govern current civilization are based on scarcity assumptions that may be deliberately cultivated rather than naturally determined. Land scarcity, resource scarcity, population pressure. These are the fundamental drivers of conflict in official historical narratives. If land beyond the poles is real and habitable, those scarcity arguments collapse. For the Tartarian framework, this connects to a broader argument about what was lost in the civilization reset. The old civilization, whatever we choose to call it, apparently operated on different scarcity assumptions. The evidence of free energy transmission in old architecture, the evidence of global communication networks implied by similar construction techniques appearing simultaneously on different continents, the evidence of a political organization sophisticated enough to coordinate continent-spanning infrastructure projects, all of this suggests a civilization that had solved the scarcity problems that current civilization still struggles with. The suppression of polar geography is, in this reading, of a piece with the suppression of free energy technology and the suppression of historical architectural evidence. It is all part of the same project. Maintaining the scarcity conditions that make the current system of political and economic control possible. Byrd knew something about this. His 1947 interview suggests he knew it. His subsequent behavior, a long period of relative public silence broken only by carefully managed statements in controlled American media environments, suggests that he was permitted to say certain things and not others. The fact that the El Mercurio interview happened in Chile rather than in the United States is itself worth examining. Byrd was not a man who lacked access to American media. He was one of the most celebrated public figures in the country. If he wanted to give an interview to the New York Times would have answered the phone. The fact that he chose to speak to a Chilean newspaper about his most provocative geographical observations is either a very strange coincidence or a calculated decision. Some researchers have argued that Byrd was testing the waters, that he knew his observations would be suppressed in the American press, and that he chose a foreign outlet precisely because he wanted the information to exist in the public record somewhere, even if it was unlikely to reach the American public directly. This is speculative, but it is not irrational. Men in Byrd's position sometimes used exactly this kind of indirect disclosure strategy when they wanted to say something they could not say directly. The Cold War context matters here. By 1947, the United States and the Soviet Union were already well into the early stages of what would become the defining political conflict of the 20th century. Antarctica was becoming a site of strategic interest, not just for its geographic location, but for what it might contain. Both superpowers were investing heavily in polar research and polar military capability. The competitive pressure to understand and potentially control Antarctic geography was intense. If Byrd's Operation Highjump had encountered something genuinely anomalous in Antarctic geography, there would have been immediate and overwhelming pressure to classify that information. The Cold War provided the perfect justification for secrecy. Anything that could be framed as a strategic military matter could be removed from public discussion without explanation. The press cooperated with these classification decisions routinely during the Cold War era. This was not censorship in the traditional sense. It was a normalized culture of deference to military and intelligence authority on national security matters. Byrd's El Mercurio statements, if genuine, could easily have been classified under exactly this framework: land beyond the poles with strategic military implications, national security concern, do not reprint. The Chilean press was outside this system of normalized deference. El Mercurio was a major national newspaper with a long history of independent journalism. It had no particular obligation to defer to American military classification decisions. If Byrd said something interesting, they printed it. That is exactly what appears to have happened. Let us now examine the specific diary material that researchers have used to supplement the newspaper interview, because the Byrd diary adds another layer to this story that is worth careful examination. Byrd reportedly kept a detailed personal diary of his 1947 polar flight, and excerpts from this diary have circulated in alternative history circles for decades. The diary describes, in first-person present tense, a flight experience that begins as a routine polar survey and transitions into something that Byrd himself describes as impossible. According to the diary excerpts, Byrd's aircraft instruments began behaving anomalously as he flew beyond the pole. He describes the outside temperature rising rather than falling. He describes seeing what appears to be green land below him where ice should be. He describes encountering a craft that he could not identify, that flew alongside his aircraft for a period, and that did not respond to radio contact. He describes being directed to land and being met by what he characterized as a civilization. The authenticity of the diary excerpts has been contested extensively. No original handwritten diary has been produced for independent scholarly verification. The excerpts that circulate online vary in specific wording, suggesting either multiple translations or multiple versions of the document. Some researchers believe the diary is genuine and that the variations in wording reflect different transcription sources. Others believe the diary is a later fabrication designed to add color to the more verifiable newspaper interview. What is not contested is that Byrd himself, in his own words in a Chilean newspaper, described geography beyond the poles that he had personal experience of. That much does not depend on the diary. The diary, if genuine, simply adds detail to what Byrd was already describing publicly. The pattern of information behavior around this episode is consistent with the broader pattern that Tartarian researchers identify across multiple domains of suppressed historical knowledge. A significant discovery is made. The discoverer makes limited public statements about it. The mainstream press in the country best positioned to investigate the discovery does not pursue it. The discoverer subsequently limits further public discussion. The discovery is folded into classified military research. Decades later, fragments of the original information surface in alternative research communities and are systematically labeled as conspiracy theory. This is not a unique pattern. It recurs with enough consistency across enough different subject areas that the alternative research community has developed relatively sophisticated frameworks for analyzing it. The Tartarian framework is one of the most comprehensive of these analytical systems because it provides a coherent explanation for why so much diverse information gets suppressed. It is not suppressed because it is false. It is suppressed because it is true, and because the truth of it undermines the foundational narratives that sustain current political and economic arrangements. Operation High Jump was not the last large-scale American military operation in Antarctica. In 1958, the United States established a permanent presence at McMurdo Station on the Antarctic coast. Between 1958 and 1962, the United States also conducted a series of high-altitude nuclear tests near the Antarctic region under a program called Project Argus, officially to study the effects of nuclear explosions on the Earth's magnetic field. Researchers working in the Tartarian framework have noted something interesting about the geographic targeting of the Project Argus tests. The explosions were concentrated in a ring pattern around the Antarctic region at specific latitudes. If you were trying to create a permanent electromagnetic barrier around a specific geographic area, you might target your explosions in exactly this pattern. Project Argus was conducted the year before the Antarctic Treaty was signed. The treaty locked down surface access to Antarctica. The nuclear tests created lasting electromagnetic effects in the radiation belts above it. Whether by design or coincidence, the combination produced the effect of making independent investigation of Antarctic geography significantly more difficult. The technological suppression dimension of the Tartarian framework is relevant here. One of the most persistent arguments in alternative history research is that free energy technology, the wireless transmission that Nikola Tesla was working toward at the end of his career, was suppressed because it would destabilize economic arrangements built around controlled energy scarcity. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was defunded. His notes were seized upon his death. His backing dried up precisely when his research moved toward publicly accessible transmission. The suppression of polar geography runs parallel. If free energy was suppressed because it would democratize access to power, polar geography was suppressed because it would democratize access to land. Both serve the same interest, maintaining artificial scarcity as the condition that makes existing power arrangements stable. A civilization beyond the poles that retained the original Tartarian technology would not be a curiosity. It would be a threat to every political and economic system built on the assumption that that technology was lost. There is one more piece of this story that deserves careful attention, and it involves the specific timing of Byrd's public statements relative to the development of the American nuclear program. The first American nuclear test, the Trinity test, occurred in July of 1945. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki followed in August of 1945. By 1947, the United States was the world's sole nuclear power, a status that would persist until the Soviet Union's first successful nuclear test in 1949. The period between 1945 and 1949 was, in a sense, the moment of maximum American military confidence. The country had developed the most destructive weapon in human history and was the only nation that possessed it. This period was also, not coincidentally, the period when Operation High Jump was conducted and when Byrd gave his El Mercurio interview. Some researchers have suggested that the nuclear program was related to the polar geography question in ways official history has not acknowledged. That nuclear weapons were developed in part as a deterrent against whatever military capability had been encountered in the polar regions. That Project Argus was an attempt to use nuclear technology specifically against that region. Why would the American military spend so many resources on Antarctic operations if the continent had no strategic value? Why would the nations of the world agree so readily to internationalize it? Why would Byrd's statements to a Chilean newspaper be ignored by the American press, despite his enormous public profile? The Tartarian framework provides answers to all of these questions. The mainstream historical framework does not. What does all of this mean practically? If the Byrd interview is genuine, and if the statements it contains represent accurate observations rather than misquotations or translation errors, then the geography of the Earth is significantly different from what official maps show. There is land beyond the poles that no official cartographic authority has mapped. That land has been visited by at least one American military expedition, and apparently by whatever civilization lives there. The information about this land has been suppressed through a combination of press deference, military classification, treaty arrangements, and possibly active electromagnetic interference with the region. The Tartarian framework situates this suppression within a longer history of civilization management. The Old World, whatever it was and wherever it reached, was apparently sophisticated enough to have survived the reset event that destroyed most of the evidence of its existence. The survivors of that civilization may still exist. They may exist beyond the poles. And the system of information control that keeps us from knowing about them is the same system that tells us the Renaissance invented everything, that Tesla's work was impractical, that the world's fair buildings were made of plaster and chicken wire, and that the polar regions are empty. We are, according to this framework, operating within a deliberately constructed ignorance. The walls of that ignorance are maintained by systems we call science, journalism, education, and international law. The cracks in those walls show up in places like a Chilean newspaper from 1947, a diary that the American government apparently preferred not to publish, a military operation that came back early and without explanation, and a treaty that locked down an entire continent before most of the world had any idea why. Byrd saw something, he told the Chileans. America stayed quiet, and 77 years later we are still asking why. The evidence, taken in aggregate, points toward a conclusion that the mainstream historical framework is structurally incapable of accommodating. Not because the individual pieces of evidence are individually overwhelming, but because the pattern they form, when viewed through the Tartarian lens, is coherent in a way that no official explanation has managed to match. Maps that are too accurate, buildings that are too sophisticated, an explorer who said things in Chile that he was not permitted to say in America, a military operation that came home early, a treaty that locked away a continent A series of nuclear tests that created electromagnetic effects precisely where independent investigation would be most dangerous. These are not the random artifacts of a disorganized history. They are the consistent signature of managed information. And managed information, on this scale and across this many domains, implies a very specific kind of management. It implies knowledge of something that the people doing the managing do not want the rest of us to have. What they do not want us to have is the knowledge that the world is larger than we were told. That the civilization we inherited from the reset event was not the first advanced civilization on this planet. That there are places on this earth that contain evidence of that previous civilization, intact and accessible, and that someone or something is still there. Byrd knew, he said so. Chile heard him. The question is whether we are finally ready to listen.